It by Stephen King. Sometimes, most times, the word would come. Other times it simply refused. He had been hit by a car when he was 3 and knocked into the side of a building. He had remained unconscious for 7 hours. Mom said it was that accident which had caused the stutter. George sometimes got the feeling that his dad and Bill himself was not so sure. The piece of paraffin in the bowl was almost entirely melted. The match flame guttered lower, growing blue as it hugged the cardboard stick, and then it went out. Blue dipped his finger into the liquid, jerked it out with a faint hiss. He smiled apologetically at George. "Hot," he said. After a few seconds, he dipped his finger in again and began to smear the wax along the sides of the bow, where it quickly dried to a milky haze. "Can I do some?" George asked. "Okay, just don't get any on the blankets or Mom will kill you." George dipped his finger into the paraffin, which was now very warm but no longer hot, and began to spread it along the other side of the boat. "Don't put on so much, you a-hole," Bill said. "You want to sink it on its maiden cruise?" "I'm sorry. That's all right. Just go easy." George finished the other side, then held the boat in his hands. It felt a little heavier, but not much. "Too cool," he said. "I'm gonna go out and sail it." "Yeah, you do that," Bill said. He suddenly looked tired. Tired and still not very well. "I wish you could come," George said. He really did. Bill sometimes got bossy after a while, but he always had the coolest ideas, and he hardly ever hit. "It's your boat, really." "She," Bill said. "You call boats she." "She, then." "I wish I could come too," Bill said glumly. "Well," George shifted from one foot to the other, the boat in his hands. "You put on your rain stuff," Bill said, "or you'll wind up with the who, like me. Probably catch it anyway, from my germs." "Thanks, Bill. It's a neat boat." And he did something he hadn't done for a long time, something Bill never forgot. He leaned over and kissed his brother's cheek. "You'll catch it for sure now, you a-hole," Bill said, but he seemed cheered up all the same. He smiled at George. "Put all this stuff back, too, or Mom will have a bird." "Sure." He gathered up the waterproof equipment and crossed the bedroom. The boat perched precariously on top of the paraffin box, which was sitting askew in the little bowl. Georgie?" George turned back to look at his brother. "Be careful." "Sure." His brow creased a little. "That was something your mom said, not your big brother." It was as strange as him giving Bill a kiss. "Sure I will." He went out. Bill never saw him again. Now here he was, chasing his boat down the left side of Witcham Street. He was running fast, but the water was running faster, and his boat was pulling ahead. He heard a deepening roar and saw that 50 yards farther down the hill, the water in the gutter was cascading into a storm drain that was still open. It was a long, dark semicircle cut into the curving, and as George watched, a stripped branch, its bark as dark and glistening as sealskin, shot into the storm drain's maw. It hunched up there for a moment and then slipped down inside. That was where his boat was headed. "Oh shit, and Shinola!" he yelled, dismayed. He put on speed, and for a moment he thought he would catch the boat. Then one of his feet slipped, and he went sprawling, skinning one knee and crying out in pain. From his new pavement-level perspective, he watched his boat swing around twice, momentarily caught in another whirlpool, and then disappear. "Shit and Shinola!" he yelled again, and slammed his fist down on the pavement. That hurt too, and he began to cry a little. What a stupid way to lose the boat. He got up and walked over to the storm drain. He dropped to his knees and peered in. The water made a dank, hollow sound as it fell into the darkness. It was a spooky sound. It reminded him of... Huh. The sound was jerked out of him as if on a string, and he recoiled. There were yellow eyes in there, the sort of eyes he had always imagined but never actually seen down in the basement. "It's an animal," he thought incoherently. "That's all it is. Some animal. Maybe a house cat that got stuck down in there." Still, he was ready to run. Would run in a second or two. When his mental switchboard had dealt with the shock those two shiny yellow eyes had given him, he felt the rough surface of the macadam under his fingers, and the thin sheet of cold water flowing around them. He saw himself getting up and backing away, and that was when a voice, a perfectly reasonable and rather pleasant voice, spoke to him from inside the storm drain. "Hi." "Hi, Georgie," it said. George blinked and looked again. He could barely credit what he saw. It was like something from a made-up story or a movie where the animals will talk and dance. If he had been 10 years older, he would not have believed what he was seeing, but he was not 16. He was 6. There was a clown in the storm drain. The light in there was far from good, but it was good enough so that George Denbrough was sure of what he was seeing. It was a clown, like in the circus or on TV. In fact, he looked like a cross between Bozo and Clarabelle, who talked by honking his, or was it her? George was never really sure of the gender. Horn on Howdy Doody Saturday mornings. Buffalo Bob was just about the only one who could understand Clarabelle, and that always cracked Georgie up. The face of the clown in the storm drain was white, and there were funny tufts of red hair on either side of his bald head, and there was a big clown smile painted over his mouth. If George had been inhabiting a later year, he would have surely thought of Ronald McDonald before Bozo or Clarabelle. The clown held a bunch of balloons, all colors, like George's ripe fruit in one hand. In the other, he held Georgie's newspaper boat. "Want your boat, Georgie?" The clown smiled. George smiled back. He couldn't help it. It was the kind of smile you just had to answer. "I sure do," he said. The clown laughed. "I sure do. That's good. That's very good. And how about a balloon?" "Well, sure." He reached forward and then drew his hand reluctantly back. "I'm not supposed to take stuff from strangers. My dad said so." "Very wise of your dad," the clown in the storm drain said, smiling. How, Georgie wondered, could I have thought his eyes were yellow? They were a bright dancing blue, the color of his mom's eyes and Bill's. "Very wise indeed. Therefore I will introduce myself. I, Georgie, am Mr. Bob Gray, also known as Pennywise the Dancing Clown." "Pennywise, meet George Denbrough. George, meet Pennywise. And now we know each other. I'm not a stranger to you, and you're not a stranger to me. Correct?" George giggled. "I guess so." He reached forward again and drew his hand back again. "How did you get down there?" "Storm just blew me away," Pennywise the Dancing Clown said. "It blew the whole circus away. Can you smell the circus, Georgie?" Georgie leaned forward. Suddenly he could smell peanuts, hot roasted peanuts, and vinegar, the white kind you put on your French fries through a hole in the cap. He could smell cotton candy and frying doughboys, and the faint but thunderous odor of wild animal shit. He could smell the cheery aroma of Midway sawdust, and yet under it all was a smell of flood and decomposing leaves and dark storm drain shadows. That smell was sweet and rotten, the cellar smell. But the other smells were stronger. "You bet I can smell it," he said. "Want your boat, Georgie?" Pennywise asked. "I only repeat myself because you really do not seem that eager." He held it up, smiling. He was wearing a baggy silk suit with great big orange buttons. A bright tie, electric blue, flopped down his front, and on his hands were big white gloves, like the kind Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck always wore. "Yes, sure," Georgie said, looking into the storm drain. "In the balloon, I've got red and green and yellow and blue." "Do they float?" "Float?" The clown's grin widened. "Oh, yes, indeed they do. They float, and there's cotton candy." George reached. The clown seized his arm, and Georgie saw the clown's face change. What he saw then was terrible enough to make his worst imaginings of the thing in the cellar look like sweet dreams. What he saw destroyed his sanity in one clawing stroke. "They float," the thing in the drain crooned in a clotted, chuckling voice. It held George's arms in its thick and wormy grip. It pulled George toward the terrible darkness where the water rushed and roared and bellowed as it bore its cargo of storm debris toward the sea. Georgie craned his neck away from that final blackness and began to scream into the rain, to scream mindlessly into the white autumn sky which curved above Derry on that day in the fall of 1957. His screams were shrill and piercing, and all up and down Witcham Street people came to their windows or bolted out onto their porch. "They float," it growled. "They float, Georgie, and when you're down here with me, you'll float too." Georgie's shoulders socked against the cement of the curb, and Dave Gardner, who had stayed home from his job at the shoe boat, That day, because of the flood, saw only a small boy in a yellow rain slicker, a small boy who was screaming and writhing in the gutter, with muddy water surfacing over his face and making his screams sound bubbly. "Everything down here floats," that chuckling, rotten voice whispered. Then suddenly there was a ripping noise and a flaring sheet of agony, and George Denbrough knew no more. Dave Gardner was the first to get there, and although he arrived only 45 seconds after the first scream, George Denbrough was already dead. Gardner grabbed him by the back of the slicker, pulled him into the street, and began to scream himself as George's body turned over in his hands. The left side of George's slicker was now bright red. Blood flowed to the storm drain from the tattered hole where the left arm had been. A knob of bone, horribly bright, peeked through the torn cloth. The boy's eyes stared up into the white sky, and as Dave staggered away toward the others, already running pell-mell down the street, they began to fill up with rain. Somewhere below, in the storm drain that was already filled nearly to capacity with runoff, there could have been no one down there. The county sheriff would later exclaim to a daring news reporter with a frustrated fury so great it was almost agony. Hercules himself would have been swept away in that driving current. George's newspaper boat shot onward through nighted chambers and long concrete hallways that roared and chimed with water. For a while it ran neck-toes pointed at the dripping ceiling. Then, at some junction east of the town, the Chicken was swept off to the left while George's boat went straight. An hour later, while George's mother was being sedated in the emergency room at Derry Home Hospital, and while stuttering Bill sat stunned and white and silent in his bed, listening to his father sob hoarsely in the parlor where his mother had been playing for Elise. When George went out, the boat shot out through a concrete loophole like a bullet, exiting the muzzle of a gun, and ran at speed down a sluice way and into an unnamed stream. When it joined the boiling, swollen Penobscot River 20 minutes later, the first drifts of blue had begun to show in the sky overhead. The storm was over. The boat dipped and swayed and sometimes took on water, but it did not sink. The two brothers had waterproofed it well. I did not know where it finally fetched up. If ever it did, perhaps it reached the sea, and sails were there forever, like a magic boat in a fairy tale. All I know is that it was still afloat and still running on the breast of the flood when it passed the incorporated town limits of Derry, Maine, and there it passes out of this tale forever. Chapter 2. After the Festival, 1984. The reason Adrian was wearing the hat his sobbing boyfriend would later tell the police was because he had won it at the Pitch Till You Win stall on the Basie Park Fairgrounds just 6 days before his death. He was proud of it. He was wearing it because he loved this shitty little town, the boyfriend, John Haggerty, screamed at the cops. Now, there's no need for that sort of language, Officer Harold Gardner told Haggerty. Harold Gardner was one of Dave Gardner's 4 sons. On the day his father had discovered the lifeless, one-armed body of George Denbrough, Harold Gardner had been 5. On this day, almost 27 years later, he was 32 and balding. Harold Gardner recognized the reality of John Haggerty's grief and pain, and at the same time found it impossible to take seriously. This man, if you want to call him a man, was wearing lipstick and satin pants so tight you could almost read the wrinkles in his cock. Grief or no grief, pain or no pain, he was, after all, just a queer, like his friend, the late Adrian Mellon. "Let's go through it again," Harold's partner, Geoffrey Reeves, said. "The two of you came out of the Falcon and then turned toward the canal. Then what?" "How many times do I have to tell you, idiots?" Haggerty was still screaming. "They killed him. They pushed him over the side. Just another day in Macho City for them." Don Haggerty began to cry. "One more time," Reeves repeated patiently. "You came out of the Falcon. Then what?" In an interrogation room just down the hall, 2 Derry cops were speaking with Steve Dubé, 17, in the clerk of probate's office upstairs. 2 more were questioning John Webby Garton, 18, and in the chief of police's office on the first floor. Chief Andrew Rademacher and Assistant District Attorney Tom Boutilier were questioning 15-year-old Christopher Unwin, who wore faded jeans, a grease-smeared t-shirt, and blocky engineer boots, was weeping. Rademacher and Boutillier had taken him because they had quite accurately assessed him as the weak link in the chain. "Let's go through it again," Boutillier said in this office, just as Geoffrey Reeves was saying the same thing 2 floors down. "We didn't mean to kill him," Unwin blubbered. "It was the hat. We couldn't believe he was still wearing the hat after what Webby said the first time, and I guess we wanted to scare him." "For what he said?" Chief Rademacher interjected. "Yes. To John Carton on the afternoon of the 17th. Yes. To Webby." Unwin burst into fresh tears, but he tried to save them when he saw he was in trouble. "At least me and Stevie Dubé did. We didn't mean to kill him." "Come on, Chris, don't shit on us," Boutillier said. "You threw the little queer into the canal." "Yes, but—" "And the 3 of you came in to make a clean breast of things. Chief Rademacher and I appreciate that, don't we, Andy?" "You bet. It takes a man to own up to what he did, Chris. So don't fuck yourself up by lying now. You meant to throw him over the minute you saw him and his fag buddy coming out of the Falcon, didn't you?" "No," Chris Unwin protested vehemently. Boutillier took a pack of Marlboros from his shirt pocket and stuck one in his mouth. He offered the pack to Unwin. "Cigarette?" Unwin took one. Boutillier had to chase the tip with a match in order to give him a light, because of the way Unwin's mouth was trembling. "But when you saw he was wearing the hat?" Rademacher asked. Unwin dragged deep, lowered his head so that his greasy hair fell in his eyes, and jetted smoke from his nose, which was littered with blackheads. "Yeah," he said, almost too softly to be heard. Boutillier leaned forward, brown eyes gleaming. His face was predatory, but his voice was gentle. "What, Chris?" "I said yes, I guess so, to throw him in, but not to kill him." He looked up at them, face frantic and miserable, and still unable to comprehend the stupendous changes which had taken place in his life since he left the house to take in the last night of Derry's Candle Days festival with 2 of his buddy at 7:30 the previous evening. "Not to kill him," he repeated. "That guy under the bridge, I still don't know who he is." "What guy was that?" Rademacher asked, though without much interest. They had heard this part before as well, and neither of them believed it. Sooner or later, men accused of murder almost always drag out that mysterious other guy. Boutillier even had a name for it. He called it the one-armed man syndrome, after that old TV series, The Fugitive. "The guy in the clown suit," Chris Unwin said, and shivered. "The guy with the balloons."